A widow offers shelter to a mysterious drifter, and his boy, unaware he's the new territorial governor sent to investigate corruption, destroying her town. Blood and politics collide when kindness meets power. The boy stumbled first, his small legs finally giving out after miles of walking through dust that clung to everything like a second skin. Martha Whitmore saw them from her kitchen window, a tall man in a worn coat helping a child no older than 7 to his feet, both of them swaying like wheat in a hard wind. She didn't hesitate. The door was open before they reached her porch, and her arms were already reaching for the boy who looked ready to collapse into the dirt. "Water," the man said, his voice cracked from thirst and exhaustion. Not a demand, just a simple word that carried the weight of desperation. Martha nodded, guiding them both inside her modest cabin without question. In a territory where neighbors were scarce and help even scarcer, you didn't turn away travelers, especially when one was barely tall enough to reach your waist. The man's eyes swept her home quickly, professionally, taking in details most drifters wouldn't notice. The quality of her furniture, the books on her shelves, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite her simple dress. "I'm Martha," she said, settling the boy into her best chair near the cold fireplace. "Martha Whitmore." The child's eyes were huge in his thin face, dark as winter nights and filled with an exhaustion that belonged on no 7-year-old. "This here's Tommy," the man said, his hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. "I'm Daniel Crawford." The name meant nothing to Martha, which was exactly what Daniel Crawford had hoped. Out here, 3 days' hard ride from the territorial capital. He was just another drifter with a child in tow, not the newly appointed governor sent to investigate reports of corruption that were bleeding the frontier towns dry. Martha brought them both water first, then bread and butter, then a pot of stew that had been simmering since morning. She watched Daniel eat with the methodical hunger of a man who'd gone without meals before, but his eyes never left Tommy, making sure the boy got his fill first. There was love there, fierce and protective, the kind that made Martha's chest tighten with memories of her own children, lost to fever 3 winters past. "How far you traveled?" she asked softly, refilling Tommy's cup. The boy looked up at Daniel before answering, a silent exchange that spoke of shared hardships and mutual dependence. "From back east," Daniel replied carefully. "Looking for work, maybe a place to settle down for Tommy here." It wasn't entirely a lie. His real work, investigating the systematic theft of federal funds meant for frontier development, required settling somewhere long enough to observe, to listen, to understand who was robbing these communities blind. But watching Martha fuss over Tommy with the gentle care of a born mother, Daniel felt an unexpected twist in his chest. He'd expected to conduct his investigation with cold, professional detachment. He hadn't expected to find himself in the home of a woman whose kindness reminded him of everything he'd lost when his wife died birthing Tommy 7 years ago. Martha cleared the dishes without being asked, her movements efficient but unhurried. "You planning to move on tomorrow?" she asked, and Daniel caught something in her voice, not quite hope but maybe the absence of loneliness that had lived in this cabin too long. "Depends," he said honestly. "Tommy's been walking hard for days, could use a real rest." The boy had already fallen asleep in the chair, his head tilted against the worn cushion, small hands still clutching his empty cup. Martha smiled, the first real smile Daniel had seen since they arrived, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to something that made his breath catch. "There's a room in back," she offered. "Nothing fancy, but the bed's sound and the roof don't leak." Daniel studied her face, looking for the angle, the catch, the price that always came with kindness in his experience. But Martha Whitmore's eyes held only genuine concern for a tired child and his father. "That's generous of you, ma'am," he said slowly, "but we can't pay much." Martha waved away his concern with a flour-dusted hand. "Payment's not what matters out here. Besides," she added, glancing at Tommy's sleeping form, "house gets quiet with just me rattling around in it." The admission cost her something. Daniel could see it in the way her shoulders tensed. This was a woman who'd learned to live with loss, who'd built walls around her heart that kindness was slowly wearing thin. That night, after Tommy was tucked into the small back room and sleeping deeply for the first time in weeks, Daniel sat with Martha at her kitchen table sharing coffee that tasted like civilization after days of trail water. "You been alone long?" he asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. But Martha didn't seem offended. "3 years," she said simply. "Husband died in a mining accident up north. Children." She stopped, her hand tightening around her cup. "Fever took them the winter after." Daniel felt the familiar weight of shared grief settle between them. "Tommy's mother died when he was born," he offered quietly. "Been just the two of us since." Martha nodded, understanding passing between them without need for more words. They were both survivors, both protectors of what little family they had left. "What kind of work you looking for?" she asked, steering away from painful memories. Daniel considered his answer carefully. His real work was delicate, dangerous even. The corruption he was investigating reached high into territorial government, involved men with power and money who wouldn't hesitate to silence a troublesome investigator. But something about Martha's steady gaze, her honest concern, made him want to trust her with more than he should. "Whatever needs doing," he said finally. "I've got experience with books, accounts, that sort of thing." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. "Might be you're exactly what this town needs," Martha said, and something in her tone made Daniel look up sharply. She was staring into her coffee, her brow furrowed with worry. "Things been going poorly here lately, real poorly." Daniel leaned forward, his investigator instincts suddenly alert. "How so?" Martha hesitated, glancing toward the back room where Tommy slept. "Maybe that's talk for another time," she said quietly, "when little ears ain't so close." But her expression told Daniel everything he needed to know. Whatever was happening in this town, it was exactly what he'd been sent to investigate. And Martha Whitmore, whether she knew it or not, might be the key to understanding it all. The next morning brought the sound of horses and raised voices that shattered the peaceful quiet of Martha's cabin. Daniel was up and at the window before Martha could rise from her chair, his body moving with the instincts of a man who'd lived through more than his share of trouble. 3 men sat mounted in Martha's yard, their horses snorting and stamping with impatience that matched their riders' aggressive postures. The man in front was well-dressed but soft, the kind of person who'd never done an honest day's work but wielded power like a club. Behind him, 2 others with the hard eyes and easy-gun hands of hired muscle. "Mrs. Whitmore," the leader called out, his voice carrying false politeness that fooled no one. "Need to have a word with you about them back taxes." Martha's face went white as fresh snow. She moved to the door with shoulders squared but hands trembling slightly, the bearing of a woman who'd faced this kind of trouble before and knew it only got worse with time. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear Daniel could see in her eyes. "Told you last time I ain't got no back taxes. Paid everything current just last month." Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Well now, seems there's been some confusion about that. New assessments came through. Turns out you owe quite a bit more than you thought." Daniel stepped into the doorway beside Martha. Tommy pressed close behind him, the boy's eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from seeing adults scared. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Daniel, taking in his worn clothes and travel dust, dismissing him as another drifter not worth worrying about. It was exactly the kind of mistake that men like Blackwood always made, assuming that power and position were the same thing as intelligence and observation. "This your business, stranger?" Blackwood asked, his tone suggesting it had better not be. Daniel's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to reveal who he was, to use his authority to send these vultures packing. But showing his hand too early would destroy any chance of learning who was really behind the systematic theft of federal funds that was destroying communities like this one. "Just a guest," Daniel said carefully, his arm moving protectively around Tommy. "Passing through with my boy." Blackwood nodded dismissively and turned back to Martha. "Like I was saying, Mrs. Whitmore, new assessment puts your tax debt at $500, due immediate." Martha gasped, the sound like a physical blow. $500 was more money than most frontier families saw in 2 years of hard work. It was highway robbery dressed up in legal language, the kind of corruption Daniel had been sent to root out. But watching Martha's face crumble, seeing Tommy press closer to his father in fear, made this personal in a way his official duties never could. "I don't have $500, Martha said quietly. "Don't have 50. You know that, Mr. Blackwood." The man's smile turned predatory. "Well then, we got us a problem. Territory don't wait for folks to come up with money they owe. But I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. Whitmore, reasonable and generous." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to an oily whisper that made Daniel's hands clench into fists. "Sign over the deed to this property and we'll call it even. You can stay on as a tenant, pay reasonable rent. Everyone walks away happy." The offer was as transparent as it was vile. Steal her land through fake taxes, then charge her rent to live in her own home. Martha's hand found Daniel's arm, her fingers gripping tight enough to leave marks. She was drowning and they both knew it. Without family, without money, without connections, she had no way to fight men like Blackwood who hid theft behind legal documents and territorial authority. "I need time," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, just give me some time to figure this out." Blackwood's patience evaporated like morning dew. "Time's up, Mrs. Whitmore. You got till tomorrow evening to make your decision. Deed or eviction, your choice." He wheeled his horse around, his companions following, leaving Martha and Daniel standing in a cloud of dust and the bitter taste of injustice. Tommy tugged at Daniel's coat, his small voice barely above a whisper. "Papa, why were those men being mean to Miss Martha?" Daniel knelt down to Tommy's level, his heart breaking at the innocence in his son's eyes. "How do you explain to a 7-year-old that some people took pleasure in destroying others, that power without compassion was the cruelest weapon of all?" "Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices, son," he said finally. "But that doesn't mean we have to let them get away with it." Martha was still staring down the road where Blackwood and his men had disappeared, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "I'm going to lose everything," she said so quietly Daniel almost didn't hear. "My husband built this place with his own hands. My children took their first steps on these floorboards, and tomorrow it's all going to belong to a man who's never done an honest day's work in his life." Daniel stood slowly, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. He could reveal his true identity now, use his authority as territorial governor to stop Blackwood's extortion immediately. But doing so would expose his investigation before he understood the full scope of the corruption, potentially allowing the real architects of this systematic theft to escape justice. Yet watching Martha's quiet despair, feeling Tommy's small hand slip trustingly into his, Daniel found his professional detachment cracking like ice in spring sun. These weren't abstract victims of governmental corruption. They were people he was coming to care about, people whose trust and kindness had reminded him that there was still good in the world worth protecting. Daniel found Martha in her garden at dawn, kneeling between rows of struggling vegetables with dirt-stained hands and red-rimmed eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. She was pulling weeds with mechanical precision, as if keeping busy could somehow solve the impossible situation Blackwood had thrust upon her. Tommy was still sleeping in the back room, exhausted from yesterday's travel, and the emotional weight of seeing the only safe harbor they'd found in weeks suddenly threatened. Daniel approached quietly, settling onto an overturned crate beside her garden plot without invitation. "There has to be another way," Martha said without looking up, her voice hoarse from tears she'd shed in private. 20 years I've been paying taxes on this land. 20 years of receipts, records, everything documented proper. How can they just decide I owe money I never owed before?" Daniel watched her hands shake as she worked, fury and helplessness warring in every movement. He'd seen this pattern in dozens of territorial reports, fabricated tax assessments, forged documents, legal theft disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. But reading about corruption in government files was different from watching it destroy a woman who'd shown him nothing but kindness. "Tell me about Blackwood," Daniel said quietly. "How long has he been making trouble for folks around here? Martha sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Started about 2 years ago, right after the territorial government appointed him tax assessor. At first it was just little things, fees that seemed too high, paperwork that got lost and had to be refiled with penalties. But lately, she gestured helplessly at her modest cabin, her small garden, the life she'd built from nothing after losing everything. Lately, it feels like he's targeting anyone who can't fight back. Widows, old folks, families barely scraping by. Daniel's jaw tightened as the picture became clearer. Blackwood wasn't working alone. This kind of systematic theft required backing from higher up the territorial chain of command. Someone was using fabricated tax assessments to steal prime land from vulnerable residents, then selling it to developers and mining companies for massive profits. It was exactly the kind of corruption his investigation was meant to expose, but the human cost was more devastating than any government report could capture. "What happened to the others?" he asked. "The ones who couldn't pay these phantom taxes?" Martha's expression darkened. "The Hendersons lost their ranch last spring. 40 years they'd been working that land, built it up from nothing. Now it belongs to some mining company back east, and the Hendersons are sharecropping on land that used to be theirs. Old Pete Morrison lost his general store to back taxes he never knew he owed. Store's been closed ever since. Turns out Blackwood's friends didn't want to run a business. They just wanted to eliminate the competition for their own mercantile." Each story was another nail in the coffin of Daniel's professional detachment. These weren't statistics in a corruption report. They were neighbors, friends, the backbone of a community being systematically destroyed by greed. "There's got to be someone higher up you can appeal to," Daniel suggested, knowing even as he said it how hollow the words sounded. Martha's bitter laugh confirmed his fears. "Blackwood reports to the territorial assessor's office. Word is they're the ones telling him which properties to target, and the territorial assessor answers to," she shrugged helplessly, "someone in the capital who's probably getting rich off all this stolen land." Daniel felt the weight of his secret identity like a stone in his chest. He was the someone she was talking about, the territorial governor who was supposed to protect citizens from exactly this kind of abuse. But revealing that truth now would end his investigation before he could identify all the players in this theft ring. Tommy's sleepy voice called from the cabin, breaking the heavy silence between them. "Papa, Miss Martha, I'm hungry." Martha was on her feet instantly, her maternal instincts overriding her despair. "Course you are, sweet boy. Come on, let's get some breakfast in you." She bustled toward the cabin with forced cheerfulness, but Daniel saw the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was looking. This woman was drowning, and the very people who should have been protecting her were the ones holding her under. Inside, Martha set about preparing breakfast with the kind of desperate normalcy that people clung to when their world was falling apart. She scrambled eggs and fried bacon while humming softly to Tommy, who chattered about dreams of horses and adventures with the resilience only children possessed. Daniel watched them both, his heart aching with the knowledge that he could solve Martha's immediate problem with a single word. But doing so might let the real criminals escape justice, allowing this pattern of theft to continue in other towns, destroying other families. "Miss Martha," Tommy said around a mouthful of eggs, "why were those men making you sad yesterday?" Martha's hand stilled on the serving spoon, her composure threatening to crack again. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about complicated things," she said carefully. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart." But Tommy had spent 7 years reading his father's moods, understanding adult tensions that most children his age couldn't grasp. "Papa, can't you make them stop being mean to Miss Martha?" he asked, his dark eyes wide with the kind of faith children had in their parents' ability to fix anything. Daniel felt his chest tighten at his son's innocent question. "It's complicated, Tommy," he said gently. "Sometimes helping people means doing things that take time to work properly." It was an inadequate answer, he knew, but how do you explain political maneuvering and legal strategy to a 7-year-old who just wanted to protect someone who'd been kind to him? Tommy frowned. clearly unsatisfied with adult complexity, but went back to his breakfast without pressing further. Martha caught Daniel's eye over Tommy's head, and he saw understanding there. She recognized the helplessness of a parent trying to shield a child from harsh realities while still being honest. After breakfast, Daniel excused himself to walk the perimeter of Martha's property, ostensibly to help with morning chores but really to think through his options. The land was good, fertile soil, reliable water source, perfect for either farming or development. No wonder Blackwood's criminal enterprise had targeted it. From a professional standpoint, Daniel knew he should maintain his cover, continue gathering evidence until he could expose the entire corruption network. But from a personal standpoint, watching Martha's quiet dignity in the face of legalized theft made him want to abandon protocol and use every ounce of his authority to protect her. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his brooding. Daniel looked up to see a single rider coming up the road, a woman this time, well-dressed but with the kind of practical bearing that suggested she was more than just another territorial official's wife. She dismounted with easy confidence and approached with a smile that seemed genuine, though Daniel's instincts warned him to be cautious. After yesterday's encounter with Blackwood, anyone connected to the territorial government was suspect until proven otherwise. "Morning," the woman called out. "I'm Sarah Blackwood. Heard there was some trouble here yesterday involving my husband." Daniel's blood ran cold. This was Blackwood's wife come to finish whatever her husband had started, but her tone was apologetic rather than threatening, and her eyes held something that looked remarkably like shame. "I wanted to apologize for James's behavior," she continued, glancing toward the cabin where Martha was visible through the kitchen window. "He's been different lately. Harder, not the man I married." The admission caught Daniel off guard. This wasn't what he'd expected from the wife of a corrupt territorial official. Martha emerged from the cabin, Tommy close behind her, both of them tense at the sight of another Blackwood on their property. "Mrs. Blackwood," Martha said carefully, her voice neutral but wary. "If you're here about yesterday's business, I already told your husband I need more time." Sarah Blackwood shook her head quickly. "I'm not here about taxes or assessments or any of that official nonsense. I'm here because what James is doing to you and others like you is wrong, and I can't stand by and watch it anymore." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, unexpected and potentially explosive. Daniel studied Sarah Blackwood's face, looking for deception, for the angle that would make sense of her apparent betrayal of her own husband. But her distress seemed genuine, the kind of moral conflict that came from watching someone you loved become someone you couldn't recognize. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said carefully, "that's a serious accusation to make about your own husband." Sarah's laugh was bitter and tired. "Serious but true. James has been taking orders from men in the territorial capital, men who have promised him wealth and position in exchange for stealing land from people who can't fight back. I've seen the documents, heard the conversations he thinks I'm too stupid to understand." Martha's hand found Tommy's shoulder, pulling him closer as if Sarah's words carried physical danger. "Why are you telling us this?" she asked quietly. "If your husband finds out you've been talking to me." Sarah's expression hardened with resolve Daniel hadn't expected. "Let him find out. I've been silent too long already, watching good people lose everything while my husband gets rich off their misery. Martha, you've been nothing but kind to me over the years, even when other folks started treating me like I was tainted by James's reputation. I owe you the truth, even if it costs me my marriage." The revelation changed everything. If Sarah Blackwood was telling the truth, Daniel now had a potential inside source who could provide the evidence he needed to expose the entire corruption network. But using her information meant putting her in danger, potentially destroying her life to serve his investigation. "What kind of documents?" he asked, his investigator instincts overriding his caution. Sarah glanced nervously toward the road, as if expecting her husband to appear at any moment. "Letters from the territorial capital, names, amounts, which properties to target next, Bank records showing where the money from stolen land sales is going. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper, and a list of people who have been asking too many questions about the tax assessments. Daniel felt ice form in his veins. What kind of list? Sarah's eyes met his directly, and he saw fear there, not just for herself but for others. People who have been marked as troublemakers, folks who might try to fight back or contact authorities in the capital, the kind of people who sometimes have accidents or decide to leave town suddenly. The implication was clear and terrifying. This wasn't just theft, it was a criminal conspiracy willing to use violence to protect their operation. Martha had stumbled into something far more dangerous than simple corruption, and by extension, so had Daniel and Tommy. "Mrs. Blackwood," Martha said slowly, "if what you're saying is true, why haven't you gone to the territorial governor? Surely there's someone in authority who would listen." Sarah's expression grew even grimmer. "Because according to the documents I've seen, this goes all the way to the top. The orders are coming from someone with real power in the territorial government, someone who could make problems disappear permanently." Daniel's mind raced. If the corruption reached as high as Sarah suggested, his investigation was even more crucial and more dangerous than he'd realized. But it also meant that Martha and Tommy were in immediate peril simply by association with him. Tommy tugged at Daniel's coat, his young voice cutting through the adult tension. "Papa, I don't understand what's happening, but Miss Martha looks scared again." The innocence of his observation hit Daniel like a physical blow. His son was right. Martha's face had gone pale at Sarah's revelations, the weight of her situation suddenly much heavier than simple financial ruin. She wasn't just facing the loss of her home anymore. She was potentially facing something far worse for daring to resist theft disguised as legal authority. "Sarah," Martha whispered, her voice trembling, "what am I supposed to do? If I sign over my deed, I lose everything. If I don't—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy between them. Sarah Blackwood stepped closer, her resolve strengthening. "That's why I'm here. James thinks he's being clever, but he's not as smart as he believes. I know where he keeps his private papers, the real documents that would prove what's been happening. If someone could get to them, use them as evidence." She didn't finish the thought, but Daniel understood. She was offering to help expose her own husband's crimes, risking everything to do what was right. Daniel felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He could maintain his cover, let events play out while gathering evidence through official channels, protecting his investigation but potentially sacrificing Martha and others like her. Or he could trust Sarah Blackwood, use her inside access to get the evidence he needed quickly, but risk exposing his identity and mission prematurely. Either choice carried enormous consequences, not just for his investigation, but for the people he'd come to care about more than professional protocol should allow. That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep clutching a wooden horse Martha had carved for him, Daniel found himself sitting across from two women whose lives had become infinitely more complicated since his arrival. Sarah Blackwood had stayed through the afternoon, her presence transforming Martha's kitchen into an unlikely war room, where they planned something that felt equal parts rescue mission and suicide pact. The lamp between them cast long shadows that seemed to dance with the weight of secrets and dangerous possibilities. "Ames keeps the real documents in a locked box under our bedroom floorboards," Sarah said quietly, her fingers tracing nervous patterns on Martha's worn tablecloth. "Bank correspondence, letters from his contacts in the capital, records of every property they've stolen and who got the money. Everything we'd need to prove what's been happening." Martha leaned forward, hope and terror warring in her expression. "But getting to them means you'd have to betray your own husband. Sarah, if he finds out." Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Martha, I stopped being his wife the day I realized he was destroying innocent families for money. Now I'm just a woman living with a stranger who happens to share my name." Daniel studied Sarah's face in the flickering lamplight, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. His years of investigating corruption had taught him to trust carefully, but everything about Sarah Blackwood's demeanor suggested genuine remorse and determination to make amends for her husband's crimes. "When would you be able to access these documents?" he asked carefully. Sarah glanced toward the window, as if gauging the darkness outside. "James is meeting with his territorial contacts tomorrow night at the Copper Creek Saloon. Big planning session for their next round of property seizures. He'll be gone for hours, probably come home drunk and careless." The timing was perfect, almost suspiciously so, but Daniel sensed opportunity rather than trap. Martha reached across the table to grasp Sarah's hand. "You don't have to do this for me. I can find another way, maybe leave town, start over somewhere else." But even as she said the words, Martha's voice carried the hollow ring of defeat. They all knew she had nowhere else to go, no resources to start fresh, no family to fall back on. Leaving would mean abandoning the only home she had left, the last connection to her dead husband and children. Sarah squeezed Martha's fingers firmly. "This isn't just about you anymore. James showed me the list last week. There are 15 more families marked for theft over the next 6 months. Good people, Martha. Families with children, elderly couples who have worked their whole lives for a little piece of land to call their own." The scope of the planned destruction hit Daniel like a physical blow. 15 more families meant dozens of lives destroyed, entire communities gutted by systematic theft disguised as legal authority. His investigation could potentially stop the corruption eventually, but how many more Martha Whitmores would lose everything while he gathered evidence through proper channels? "Sarah," he said slowly, "if you help us get those documents, what happens to you afterward? Once we expose this conspiracy, your husband and his associates won't just disappear quietly." Sarah's smile was sad but determined. "I've been thinking about that all day. I have a sister in California, been writing to me for years asking me to come visit. Maybe it's time I took her up on that invitation." The plan they developed over the next 2 hours was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Sarah would wait until her husband left for his meeting, then retrieve the documents from their hiding place. Daniel would meet her at the old church on the edge of town, a location safely away from both Martha's cabin and the Blackwood house. Once they had the evidence, Daniel would ride to the territorial capital to present it to the proper authorities, while Sarah would immediately leave town for her own safety. Martha would stay at her cabin, maintaining the appearance of normalcy until Daniel could return with official help. "What about Tommy?" Martha asked suddenly, her maternal instincts focused on the sleeping child who'd already endured too much upheaval in his young life. "If something goes wrong, if they come looking for Daniel here." She didn't finish the thought, but Daniel understood her concern. His son had become collateral damage in a situation that grew more dangerous by the hour. "Tommy stays with me," Daniel said firmly. "Whatever happens, I won't leave him unprotected." But even as he said the words, Daniel felt the familiar weight of parental fear. Every choice he made now carried consequences, not just for his investigation, but for the 7-year-old boy who trusted him to keep them both safe. Sarah rose to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Martha with something like sisterly affection. "Martha, after tomorrow night, things are going to change fast. If this works, James and his friends will be finished, but they'll be desperate and dangerous before they're done. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Martha's answer came without hesitation. "Those men have been stealing from people who can't fight back, destroying families, turning neighbors against each other. If I can help stop them, I have to try. For my husband's memory, for my children who will never get to grow up on this land they loved." Her voice carried a strength Daniel hadn't heard before, the quiet courage of a woman who'd lost everything and refused to lose anything more. After Sarah disappeared into the darkness, Martha and Daniel sat in the heavy silence of people contemplating dangerous action. "You don't have to do this," Daniel said quietly. "I could leave tonight, take Tommy somewhere safe, let the territorial authorities handle this through official channels." But Martha shook her head firmly. "Those official channels have been failing people like me for months. How many more families will lose everything while bureaucrats shuffle papers and hold meetings? No, Daniel. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks that scare you." Her words carried an unconscious echo of Daniel's own thoughts, the conflict between safe procedure and urgent action that had been tearing at him since Blackwood's visit. The next day passed with agonizing slowness, every hour bringing them closer to a confrontation that could save Martha's home or destroy them all. Tommy seemed to sense the adult tension, staying closer to his father than usual and asking fewer questions about their plans. Martha moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, cleaning and cooking, and tending her garden as if normalcy could somehow protect them from what was coming. Daniel found himself watching the road constantly, half expecting to see Blackwood's men returning with new threats or ultimatums. As afternoon faded into evening, the weight of anticipation became almost unbearable. Daniel checked his pocket watch for the dozenth time, calculating and recalculating the timing of Sarah's plan. Blackwood's meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock, which meant Sarah wouldn't attempt to retrieve the documents until well after 9. The church where they'd agreed to meet was a 20-minute ride from Martha's cabin, putting Daniel's departure at around 9:30. Every minute until then felt like an hour. Every sound outside made them all freeze with nervous expectation. "Papa," Tommy said quietly as Martha served their evening meal, "are you going somewhere tonight?" Daniel's throat tightened at his son's perceptive question. Tommy had inherited his mother's ability to read people's emotions, to sense undercurrents that adults tried to hide. "I might have to go out for a little while," Daniel admitted carefully. "But Miss Martha will be here with you, and I'll be back before morning." Tommy nodded solemnly, accepting his father's explanation with the trust that made Daniel's chest ache with protective love. At 9:15, Daniel kissed Tommy goodnight and prepared to leave for the most dangerous meeting of his life. Martha walked him to the door, her face pale but determined in the lamplight. "Be careful," she whispered, her hand briefly touching his arm. "If something happens to you, Tommy will need." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Daniel understood. If tonight went wrong, if Blackwood's conspiracy was more ruthless than they suspected, Martha was promising to protect his son no matter what. "Nothing's going to happen," Daniel said with more confidence than he felt. "By tomorrow morning, this will all be over." But even as he spoke the words, Daniel felt the cold weight of uncertainty in his chest. The ride to the old church took him through moonlit countryside that should have been peaceful but felt charged with danger. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Every sound could signal approaching trouble. The church itself stood abandoned and weathered, its steeple pointing toward stars that seemed unusually bright in the clear night sky. Daniel tied his horse to a broken fence post and settled in to wait, his hand resting unconsciously on the gun at his hip. Time moved like molasses, each minute stretching until he began to wonder if Sarah had changed her mind or been discovered by her husband. When she finally appeared, Sarah Blackwood looked like a woman who'd aged years in a single day. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair disheveled, and her hands shook as she dismounted from her horse. But clutched against her chest was a leather portfolio that seemed to glow with importance in the moonlight. "I got them," she whispered, her voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "All of it, Daniel. Names, amounts, bank records, correspondence with the territorial capital. Everything we need to prove what they've been doing." She thrust the portfolio toward him with trembling hands. "But James came home early. I had to climb out our bedroom window, and I think he heard something. He'll discover the documents are missing within the hour." Daniel's blood turned to ice as the implications hit him. If Blackwood discovered the theft so quickly, he'd immediately suspect Sarah's involvement. And if he suspected Sarah, it wouldn't take him long to connect her to Martha and the mysterious drifter who'd been staying at her cabin. "Sarah, you have to leave town tonight. Right now. Don't go home, don't pack anything, just ride hard for the territorial line and don't stop." Sarah nodded, fear and determination warring in her expression. "What about Martha? If James figures out I've been talking to her?" Daniel was already swinging back onto his horse, the portfolio secured in his saddlebags. "I'll get to Martha first, get her and Tommy somewhere safe. But you have to go now, Sarah. Your life depends on it." As Sarah disappeared into the darkness, Riding hard toward whatever safety she could find, Daniel spurred his horse toward Martha's cabin with growing dread. The documents in his saddlebags contained enough evidence to destroy Blackwood's entire operation, but obtaining them had potentially signed death warrants for everyone involved. If Blackwood was as ruthless as Sarah suggested, if he was willing to use violence to protect his conspiracy, then Martha and Tommy were in immediate mortal danger. The thought of harm coming to either of them filled Daniel with a protective fury that overrode every instinct for caution and procedure. The cabin came into view just as Daniel heard the thunder of multiple horses approaching from the opposite direction. Blackwood and his men were already here, their torches visible through the trees like angry fireflies. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he was too late. The confrontation he'd hoped to avoid was about to happen whether he was ready or not. Inside that cabin were the two people who'd come to mean more to him than his professional duties, facing men who would kill without hesitation to protect their criminal enterprise. Daniel checked his gun one final time and rode toward a battle that would determine not just the success of his investigation, but the survival of the makeshift family he'd found in the most unexpected place. Daniel dismounted 50 yards from the cabin and approached on foot, using the darkness and familiar terrain to his advantage. Through Martha's kitchen window, he could see the terrifying tableau inside. Blackwood stood with his back to the glass, while two armed men flanked the doorway, their guns drawn and pointed at Martha, who sat rigidly in her chair with Tommy pressed against her side. The boy's face was white with terror, his small hands clutching Martha's dress as adult voices rose and fell with barely controlled violence. Daniel's paternal instincts screamed at him to charge through the door, guns blazing, but years of dangerous work had taught him that heroic gestures usually got innocent people killed. "Where is she?" Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the thin cabin walls, his usual oily politeness replaced by raw fury. "My wife was seen riding this direction, Mrs. Whitmore. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you haven't spoken with her." Martha's response was barely audible, but Daniel caught the tremor of fear she was fighting to hide. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Blackwood. Sarah hasn't been here since." Her words cut off abruptly, followed by the sound of a hand striking flesh. Daniel's vision went red as he realized Blackwood had just struck a defenseless woman in front of a terrified child. "Don't lie to me," Blackwood snarled, his composure cracking completely. "Sarah took documents from my private collection, documents that could destroy everything we've built here. She's been talking to someone, getting ideas about playing hero. Now I'll ask you one more time. Where is my traitorous wife, and who put her up to this?" Tommy's frightened whimper cut through the night air like a knife through Daniel's heart. His son was experiencing the kind of trauma that left permanent scars, watching helpless adults threaten the woman who'd shown them nothing but kindness. Every second Daniel waited increased the danger to both Martha and Tommy, but rushing in without a plan would likely get them all killed. Moving carefully around the cabin's perimeter, Daniel positioned himself near the back door where Martha had shown him the loose board that never quite latched properly. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see one of Blackwood's men had moved closer to Martha and Tommy, his gun now pointed directly at the boy's head. The sight sent ice through Daniel's veins and steel into his resolve. Whatever professional considerations had been holding him back evaporated in the face of a direct threat to his child. These men had just crossed a line that transformed Daniel Crawford, the undercover investigator, into Daniel Crawford, the protective father. "The thing is, Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the silky menace of a man who enjoyed inflicting fear, "I know my wife has been coming here regularly over the past few weeks. Neighborly visits, she called them. But today I discovered that someone has been very carefully documenting my business affairs, and Sarah's recent behavior suggests she's found herself some new friends with interesting ideas about law and justice." He began pacing the small kitchen like a caged predator, his polished boots clicking against Martha's carefully maintained wooden floor. "So I'll make this very simple. Tell me where Sarah went and who's been helping her, and you and the boy can pack your things and leave town peacefully." Martha's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a strength that made Daniel's chest swell with admiration even as his heart broke for what she was enduring. "Mr. Blackwood, I've told you the truth. I don't know where your wife is, and I don't know anything about any documents. All I know is that you've been stealing from honest people, and now you're threatening a child because you're afraid your crimes are catching up with you." The words hung in the cabin air like a thrown gauntlet, brave and defiant and potentially fatal. One of Blackwood's men shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with threatening a woman and child, but the other's grip tightened on his weapon. "Stealing?" Blackwood's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Mrs. Whitmore, I represent the legitimate territorial government. Everything I've done has been completely legal, authorized by proper authorities in the capital. If some residents have found the tax assessment process challenging, that's simply the cost of bringing civilization to the frontier." His voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "But what my wife has done tonight, taking confidential government documents, interfering with official business, that's treason, Mrs. Whitmore, and harboring a traitor makes you guilty of the same crime." Daniel eased the back door open inch by careful inch, grateful for Martha's meticulous care of her home that kept the hinges silent. The conversation in the kitchen continued, giving him cover as he slipped inside and moved through the small back room where Tommy had been sleeping peacefully just hours earlier. The innocent toys and carefully mended clothes scattered around the room stood in stark contrast to the violence threatening just beyond the doorway. Daniel drew his gun, checking the cylinder one final time as he prepared to reveal his true identity in the most dramatic way possible. "The boy doesn't need to see what happens next," Blackwood said, his tone suggesting that whatever he had planned would traumatize Tommy permanently. "Take him outside. Let him wait with the horses while we finish our conversation with Mrs. Whitmore." The casual way he discussed terrorizing a 7-year-old child shattered the last of Daniel's restraint. These men weren't just criminals. They were monsters who viewed innocent people as obstacles to be removed without conscience or consideration. As one of Blackwood's gunmen reached for Tommy, Daniel stepped into the kitchen doorway with his weapon drawn and his voice carrying the full authority of his office. "That's far enough," Daniel said quietly, his gun trained on Blackwood's chest. "Nobody touches the boy." The three men spun toward him with varying degrees of surprise and alarm, but Daniel's focus remained laser-sharp on protecting Martha and Tommy. "You gentlemen are under arrest for extortion, theft of public funds, and threatening federal witnesses. I suggest you put your weapons down before this situation gets any more complicated." Blackwood's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally dawning horror as he began to understand exactly who he'd been threatening. "You're him," Blackwood whispered, his arrogant composure cracking like thin ice. "The new territorial governor they sent from back east, Crawford, Daniel Crawford." The name hit the room like a thunderclap, and Daniel saw Martha's eyes widen with shock and something that might have been betrayal. She'd opened her home to a drifter with a hungry child, only to discover he was the highest-ranking government official in the territory. One of Blackwood's men made the mistake of trying to swing his gun toward Daniel, and the governor's response was swift and final. The gunshot in the confined space was deafening, and the man dropped his weapon with a cry of pain as blood flowed from his shattered wrist. "As I was saying," Daniel continued calmly, his smoking gun now pointed at the second gunman who wisely chose to drop his weapon without being shot, "you're all under arrest. Mr. Blackwood, I believe you've been conducting unauthorized business using forged territorial documents. That's a federal crime carrying a potential death sentence." Tommy had buried his face against Martha's shoulder at the sound of gunfire, but she was staring at Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also hurt at his deception, and perhaps understanding of why he'd hidden his true identity. Blackwood's remaining composure evaporated completely as the full weight of his situation became clear. He wasn't just facing exposure anymore. He was facing a territorial governor who'd witnessed him threatening a child with a loaded gun. "Governor Crawford," he said, his voice taking on the desperate, wheedling tone of a man begging for his life, "there's been a misunderstanding here. I was simply conducting routine tax collection business when—" Daniel's harsh laugh cut him off. "Routine tax collection doesn't typically involve holding guns on 7-year-old children, Mr. Blackwood. Nor does it involve forged assessment documents and systematic theft from territorial residents." "The documents," Martha said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You have Sarah's documents." It wasn't a question but a statement, and Daniel could see her mind working through the implications of everything that had happened. "You're really the territorial governor, and you've been investigating this corruption all along." The hurt in her voice was unmistakable, the pain of realizing that the man she'd trusted, the man she'd been falling in love with, had been lying to her about his most fundamental identity. "Martha," Daniel began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Tommy," Martha said gently, her voice remarkably steady despite everything they'd all endured, "why don't you go sit in your room for a few minutes while the adults finish talking?" Tommy looked up at his father with confused eyes that held too much knowledge for a 7-year-old. "Papa, are you really a governor? Like the important man in the Capitol?" Daniel knelt down to his son's level, his heart breaking at the innocence in those dark eyes. "Yes, son. I'm sorry I didn't tell you before, but sometimes grown-ups have to keep secrets to protect people they care about." Tommy nodded solemnly, accepting this latest adult complexity with the resilience that had carried him through 7 years of an uncertain life. After Tommy disappeared into the back room, Daniel turned his attention back to his prisoners. Blackwood stood with his hands raised, his face pale with the realization that his criminal enterprise had just collapsed around him. The wounded gunman sat on Martha's floor holding his shattered wrist, while his companion kept his hands carefully visible and his expression neutral. "Governor," Blackwood tried again, "if we could discuss this situation privately, I'm sure we could reach some kind of arrangement that would benefit everyone involved." The suggestion carried the unmistakable stench of attempted bribery, confirming Daniel's suspicions about how deep this corruption ran. "The only arrangement we're going to discuss, Mr. Blackwood, involves you spending the rest of your life in federal prison," Daniel replied coldly. "But first, you're going to tell me exactly who in the territorial government has been authorizing your theft operation. Names, positions, amounts of money involved. Everything." Blackwood's eyes darted toward the door as if measuring his chances of escape, but Daniel's gun never wavered. "I should mention that your wife has already provided me with extensive documentation of your crimes. Bank records, correspondence with your territorial contacts, lists of properties you've stolen. Trying to run now would only add attempted escape to your charges." Martha moved to the stove and began preparing coffee with mechanical precision, her way of coping with trauma that Daniel recognized from his years of investigating violence. Her hands shook slightly as she measured grounds and added water, but her movements remained steady and purposeful. "How long have you known?" she asked without turning around. "About the corruption, about what they were doing to families like mine." Daniel holstered his weapon, keeping careful watch on his prisoners while trying to find words that could bridge the gap his deception had created between them. "I've been investigating reports of systematic theft for 3 months, Daniel admitted quietly. "But I didn't understand the human cost until I met you and Tommy. Reading about corruption in government reports is different from watching it destroy someone you—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence that would have revealed feelings he wasn't sure he had the right to express anymore. Martha's shoulders stiffened at his unfinished words, and Daniel saw her jaw tighten with emotions she was fighting to control. "Someone you what, Governor Crawford?" The formal title carried a distance that hurt more than any accusation could have. Before Daniel could answer, the sound of approaching horses shattered the tense quiet of Martha's kitchen. Multiple riders were coming fast, their hoofbeats thundering through the night air with the urgency of men riding toward trouble. Daniel moved to the window, his gun ready, expecting to see more of Blackwood's associates coming to rescue their leader. Instead, he saw Sarah Blackwood leading a group of territorial marshals, their badges glinting in the moonlight as they surrounded Martha's cabin with professional efficiency. Relief flooded through Daniel as he realized that Sarah had done more than just escape. She'd gone straight to the territorial marshal's office with the stolen documents. "Looks like your wife decided to cooperate with federal authorities after all," Daniel told Blackwood, whose face had gone ashen at the sight of official law enforcement. "Governor Crawford," a voice called from outside, "this is Marshal Jenkins. We have warrants for the arrest of James Blackwood and associates on charges of fraud, extortion, and theft of federal funds." Daniel moved to the door, keeping his gun trained on his prisoners as he called back, "Marshal Jenkins, this is Governor Crawford. I have 3 suspects in custody, 1 wounded. The situation is secure." As the marshals entered Martha's cabin to take custody of Blackwood and his men, Daniel felt the weight of his investigation finally lifting from his shoulders. The evidence Sarah had provided, combined with his own testimony and the events of tonight, would be enough to dismantle the entire corruption network. But watching Martha's carefully controlled expression as she served coffee to the marshals, Daniel realized that solving the case might have cost him something far more valuable than any professional success could justify. The marshals worked with quiet efficiency, shackling Blackwood and his men while documenting the scene of their attempted intimidation. Marshal Jenkins, a weathered man with kind eyes and the steady demeanor of someone who'd seen too much frontier justice, interviewed Daniel and Martha separately while Tommy slept fitfully in the back room. Through it all, Martha maintained the careful politeness of a woman speaking to strangers, addressing Daniel as Governor Crawford, with a formality that created an ocean of distance between them. Each time she used his title, Daniel felt something precious slipping further away from his grasp. "The territorial attorney will want full depositions from all parties," Marshal Jenkins explained as his men prepared to transport the prisoners. "But based on the documents Mrs. Sarah Blackwood provided and the governor's testimony, we have enough evidence to hold these men indefinitely." He glanced toward Martha, who stood by her kitchen window staring into the darkness beyond her garden. "Ma'am, I know this has been a difficult night, but your cooperation may have saved dozens of families from losing their homes. The corruption these men represent goes deep into the territorial government, and your courage in standing up to them matters more than you know." Martha nodded politely but didn't turn away from the window. "Will there be a trial?" she asked quietly. "Will people like the Hendersons and Pete Morrison get their property back?" Marshal Jenkins exchanged a glance with Daniel before answering. "That's up to the territorial courts, ma'am, but I'd say their chances are good with the evidence we now have. Governor Crawford's investigation has given us the documentation we need to reverse most of the fraudulent tax seizures from the past 2 years." The words should have brought relief, but Martha's shoulders remained tense with something deeper than concern about legal proceedings. After the marshals departed with their prisoners, taking Blackwood's threats and guns with them into the night, an uncomfortable silence settled over Martha's kitchen. Daniel sat at her table nursing cold coffee while she moved restlessly around the cabin, straightening things that were already straight, cleaning dishes that were already clean. Tommy had awakened briefly when the horses departed, but fell back asleep after Daniel assured him that the bad men were gone and wouldn't be coming back. Now the cabin felt hollow despite their presence, as if something fundamental had been broken that wouldn't be easily repaired. "You must think I'm quite the fool," Martha said finally, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of hurt that made Daniel's chest ache. "Opening my door to a stranger, sharing my troubles, thinking—" She stopped, her hand stilling on the dish rag she'd been wringing between her fingers. "Thinking I'd found someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and start over." Daniel started to respond, but Martha held up a hand to stop him. "No, let me finish. You let me believe you were just a drifter with a child. someone like me who'd been dealt hard cards by life. Instead, you're the most powerful man in the territory, investigating corruption from the shadows while I poured my heart out about tax problems you already knew more about than I ever could. The accusation hit Daniel harder than any of Blackwood's threats had. Martha, I never meant to deceive you about who I am. The investigation required secrecy, and revealing my identity too early could have. Martha's bitter laugh cut him off. Could have what, Governor? Made your job more difficult. Cost you the element of surprise. She turned to face him fully, and Daniel saw tears tracking down her cheeks despite her controlled voice. Do you have any idea what it felt like? Thinking I'd found someone who might actually care about me, about Tommy, only to discover that everything you told me was a lie designed to further your investigation. Not everything was a lie, Daniel said desperately, rising from his chair to face her. My feelings for you, for what we've built here over these few days, that was real, Martha, more real than anything I've felt since my wife died. But even as he spoke the words, Daniel could see they weren't landing. Martha's expression remained closed, protected, the walls around her heart rebuilding themselves with each passing moment. How am I supposed to know what was real and what was part of your cover story? She asked quietly. How am I supposed to trust anything you've said when the most basic fact about who you are was a lie? Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes and looking between his father and Martha with the intuitive concern children developed when the adults around them were unhappy. Papa, Miss Martha, why does everyone look sad? The innocent question hung in the air like a physical weight, reminding both adults that their personal drama was affecting a child who'd already experienced too much uncertainty in his young life. Martha immediately went to Tommy, kneeling down to his level with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Nobody's sad, sweetheart, she said softly, smoothing his tousled hair with maternal tenderness that made Daniel's throat tighten. The bad men are gone, and your papa did something very brave tonight to protect people. You should be proud of him. Tommy nodded solemnly, then looked up at his father with confusion. Papa, Miss Martha keeps calling you governor. What's a governor? Daniel knelt beside Martha, achingly aware of the careful distance she maintained even while comforting his son. A governor is someone who helps make laws and protect people, Tommy. It's my job, like how some people are doctors or teachers or shopkeepers. But you told me we were looking for work, Tommy said, his brow furrowed with the kind of logical thinking that made adult deceptions complicated to maintain. If you already have a job being a governor, why do we need to find more work? Daniel felt Martha's eyes on him as he struggled to explain governmental investigation techniques to a 7-year-old. Sometimes governors have to travel around and see how people are living, make sure everyone is being treated fairly. That's what we were doing here, making sure people like Miss Martha weren't being hurt by bad men like Mr. Blackwood. Tommy accepted this explanation with the resilience of a child accustomed to adult complexity. But Daniel could see Martha cataloging every careful word, every diplomatic half-truth that illustrated the gulf between their worlds. Tommy, Martha said gently, why don't you go back to bed? Tomorrow's going to be a big day and you need your rest. After Tommy disappeared into the back room with sleepy protests about not being tired, Martha turned back to Daniel with an expression that mixed exhaustion with resignation. He trusts you completely, she observed quietly. Even when he doesn't understand what you're doing or why, he believes you'll take care of him. The words carried an implication that cut deep. Tommy's trust was pure and uncomplicated, while Martha's had been shattered by revelation and deception. Martha, please, Daniel began, but she shook her head firmly. Governor Crawford, I appreciate everything you've done for this community. Your investigation will help a lot of people, and I'm grateful for that. But I can't. She paused, struggling with words that clearly cost her something precious. I can't continue pretending that what happened between us was real when it was built on deception from the very beginning. You're going back to the territorial capital, back to your real life, and I'll stay here trying to rebuild mine. That's how these things work. Governors don't end up with frontier widows, no matter what romantic novels might suggest. The finality in her voice hit Daniel like a physical blow. "What if I didn't go back?" he asked desperately. "What if I resigned my position, stayed here, tried to build something real with you and Tommy?" But even as he spoke the words, Daniel could see how hollow they sounded. Martha's expression remained carefully neutral, the face of a woman who'd learned not to trust promises that seemed too good to be true. "You'd give up being territorial governor to live on a failing farm with a woman you've known for 4 days?" she asked quietly. "Governor, that's not love talking. That's guilt and adrenaline and the aftermath of a dangerous situation. In a week, when things settle down and you remember what your real life looks like, you'll realize what a foolish idea that was." Daniel wanted to argue, to convince her that his feelings were genuine and lasting, but the rational part of his mind recognized the truth in her words. His life was in the territorial capital, dealing with complex political situations and governmental responsibilities that required his full attention. Martha's life was here, tending her garden and maintaining the home her husband had built with his own hands. The gulf between their worlds wasn't just geographical, it was fundamental, a difference in purpose and position that couldn't be bridged by a few days of shared crisis and growing attraction. "What happens now?" Daniel asked quietly, acceptance beginning to settle over him like a heavy blanket. Martha moved to the stove, beginning preparations for morning coffee with movements that suggested she needed activity to cope with difficult emotions. "Now you take Tommy and return to your real responsibilities," she said without turning around. "The marshals will handle Blackwood's trial, the territorial courts will sort out the property seizures, and life will go back to normal. Or as normal as things get out here." Her voice carried a weariness that spoke of too many disappointments, too many times when hope had been offered only to be snatched away. "Us?" Daniel pressed, unable to let go completely of what they'd shared. Martha's hands stilled on the coffee pot, her shoulders tensing with emotions she was fighting to control. "There is no us, Governor Crawford. There's a territorial official who helped expose corruption, and there's a frontier widow who was grateful for his assistance. Anything else was just—" She paused, searching for words that would create the distance she needed. "Just two lonely people finding comfort during a difficult situation. It happens more often than you might think, but it doesn't mean anything beyond the moment." Dawn was breaking over Martha's garden as Daniel finally accepted the inevitable. He gathered his and Tommy's few possessions, while Martha prepared breakfast with mechanical efficiency, both of them moving around each other in the small cabin like dancers performing a careful choreography of separation. Tommy ate his eggs and bacon while chattering about the previous night's excitement, unaware that his father's heart was breaking with each passing minute. The boy had already grown attached to Martha, had begun thinking of her cabin as another temporary home in their series of temporary homes. "Miss Martha," Tommy said as Daniel loaded their traveling pack, "when are we coming back to visit you?" The innocent question hung in the morning air like a prayer neither adult could answer honestly. Martha knelt beside Tommy's chair, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she tried to find age-appropriate words for permanent goodbye. "Tommy, sweetheart, your papa has very important work to do in the big city. You'll be too busy with school and new friends to think about visiting old ladies in the middle of nowhere." Tommy's face fell at her words, his 7-year-old heart understanding more than his mind could process. "But I like it here," Tommy protested, his voice taking on the edge of tears. "I like your garden and your cooking and the way you tell stories. Why can't we stay?" Daniel felt his own composure threatening to crack as he watched his son experience another loss in a life already marked by too much uncertainty. "Sometimes people's paths cross for a little while, son," he said gently, "but then they have to go different directions. That doesn't mean the time together wasn't special, it just means it can't last forever." The explanation satisfied neither Tommy nor himself, but it was the best Daniel could offer under circumstances that defied easy answers. Martha walked them to the road where Daniel's horse waited patiently, her face composed but her eyes reflecting the same loss Tommy was feeling so openly. "Governor Crawford," she said formally, extending her hand for a proper goodbye, "thank you for everything you've done for this community. Your investigation will make a real difference in people's lives." Daniel took her hand, fighting the urge to pull her close and try once more to convince her that what they'd shared was worth preserving. Instead, he shook her hand with the professional courtesy she was requesting, accepting her need for distance even as it tore at his heart. "Tommy," Martha said, kneeling to hug the boy who'd brought unexpected joy into her carefully ordered world, "you be good for your papa, and remember that you're braver and stronger than you know. The world needs more people like you in it." Tommy clung to her for a long moment, his small arms tight around her neck as if he could somehow prevent this goodbye through sheer determination. When Martha finally stood and stepped back, her eyes were bright with tears she refused to shed in front of them. As Daniel lifted Tommy onto the horse and swung up behind him, the boy looked back at Martha standing in front of her cabin with the morning sun highlighting her resilient strength. "Papa," Tommy said quietly, "I think Miss Martha is sad that we're leaving." Daniel's throat tightened at his son's observation. "Yes, Tommy, I think she is. But sometimes grown-ups have to do things that make them sad because they're the right things to do." It was an inadequate explanation for the complex emotions surrounding their departure, but it was honest in its own way. They rode away from Martha's cabin as the sun climbed higher into a sky that promised another clear day, carrying with them memories of kindness and connection that would linger long after the immediate crisis had faded into history. Daniel glanced back once to see Martha still standing in her doorway, her hand raised in a final farewell that looked more like a blessing than a goodbye. Then the road curved around a stand of pines, and she was gone from sight if not from memory. 6 months later, Daniel Crawford sat in his territorial office reviewing reports that confirmed the complete dismantling of Blackwood's corruption network. 15 families had recovered their stolen property. Millions in federal funds had been restored to frontier development programs, and several high-ranking territorial officials had been imprisoned for their roles in the systematic theft. It was exactly the kind of successful investigation that built careers and earned commendations from Washington. But Daniel found himself thinking less about professional triumph than about a woman in a garden who'd shown him what real courage looked like. Tommy had adapted to life in the territorial capital with the resilience of childhood, making friends at his new school and finding adventure in the bustling streets that were so different from frontier isolation. But he still asked about Martha regularly, wondering if she'd received the letters they'd sent, if her garden was growing well, if she ever thought about the short time they'd shared her home. Daniel had no answers for his son's questions, just as he had no answers for his own persistent thoughts about the woman who'd reminded him that duty and heart didn't always point in the same direction. On his desk lay a letter from Martha that had arrived that morning, the first communication they'd received from her since their departure. Daniel had read it 3 times already, searching for something between the lines of her careful, polite prose that reported on community recovery and thanked him again for his service. But Martha Whitmore was too smart to reveal her private thoughts in correspondence with a territorial governor, too careful to risk her hard-won emotional stability on hope that had already disappointed her once. The letter was exactly what it appeared to be, a gracious update from a grateful citizen to an effective public servant, nothing more and nothing less. That evening, as Daniel tucked Tommy into bed in their comfortable house that felt nothing like home, his son asked the question that had been haunting them both. "Papa, do you think Miss Martha remembers us?" Daniel smoothed his son's dark hair, so like his mother's, and tried to find words that were both honest and comforting. "I think she remembers us every day, Tommy, just like we remember her." Tommy nodded sleepily, accepting this answer with the faith he'd always had in his father's wisdom. But as Daniel extinguished the lamp and left his son to dreams of gardens and gentle hands, he carried with him the knowledge that some kinds of remembering were more like grieving, and some choices, however necessary, left scars that never quite healed. Outside his window, the territorial capital bustled with the activity of progress and civilization, but Daniel found himself listening for sounds that weren't there. The whisper of wind through wheat, the distant call of meadowlarks, the quiet contentment of a life built on simple truths rather than complex politics. Somewhere beyond the city lights, Martha Whitmore was probably sitting at her kitchen table with her own cup of coffee, tending her own memories of what might have been. They were connected by something deeper than distance could diminish, yet separated by responsibilities neither could abandon. It was the kind of bittersweet ending that real life offered more often than storybooks, honest in its acceptance of loss, dignified in its refusal to compromise essential truths for the sake of a happier conclusion.